Afternoon, everyone. Afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department and the director of the Humanities Forum here at PC. I'd like to extend a special welcome today to those of us here who are from off campus. The Forum is very pleased this week to be hosting the keynote address of the St. Nicholas of Myra Conference. And I know many of you are attending the conference who are in the audience today. The Forum does a lot of different things. We host movie screenings, guest speakers, discussions, roundtable discussions, all sorts of things. We're particularly excited about hosting conference keynote addresses because it brings the Forum and the PC community into contact with the broader academic world. It's very important for us as a community, and especially for our students, to see the connections between what we're doing in the classroom and our broader community. Please then join us afterwards. It's always traditional for us to have a reception afterwards in the great room just down the hall. We'd love to see you there to continue the conversation. To introduce our guests this afternoon, please welcome Jeff Nicholas, a colleague of mine in the Philosophy Department and the organizer of this year's conference.
Thank you very much. So if you are in my DWC lecture, please make sure you have the paper out with your name, the date on it, and your seminar professor. Oh, and we're also taking attendance, so. Okay. So welcome to the St. Nicholas of Myra Conference on Catholic Social Thought. Our theme this year is Option for the Poor, 50 years after the Council of Medellin. I would like to thank the Humanities Forum and Dr. Raymond Hain for his support in bringing our guest speaker to campus. I also would like to thank Dean Sheila Adamas-Leota for her continuing support of the conference. As many of you know, St. Nicholas of Myra was born in Greece but lived in Turkey. He is one of the most important saints next to Mary in the Eastern Orthodox Church. He was renowned for many miracles, but we know him most for his gifts to the poor. One of my favorite stories, however, is how he went up at the Council of Nicaea and slapped Arius on the cheek for his heresy. A cool move by the saint who inspired Santa Claus, if you ask me. Dr. Elina Vuola is a professor in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki. She has also served as professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Helsinki and has held appointments at Harvard University, Northwestern University, the Chicago Theological Seminary, and the Departamento Ecumenico de Investigaciones in Costa Rica. She teaches in theology, gender studies, and Latin American studies. Her doctoral dissertation has been published as Limits of Liberation, Feminist Theology, and the Ethics of Poverty and Reproduction. Her current work, Embodied Religion, Changing Meanings of Body and Gender in Contemporary Forms of Religious Identity in Finland, aims at developing an interdisciplinary research trajectory that combines research on religion as it is lived, through ethnographic methods with theological textual analysis in order to create a more comprehensive picture of how theology and religious identities interact. Over lunch, I learned many exciting things about Dr. Vuola. She studied ethnography to engage in interviews with women in Latin America and Finland on their views of Mary. She is a world traveler, is fluent in English and Spanish. But most intriguing to me was that she lived for 6 months with the Catholic workers in Los Angeles and also worked on their farm. Today, I ask you to please join me in welcoming Professor Vuola, who is speaking on option or evasion, ecology, gender, and indigenous peoples in liberation theology. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Should I speak in English, Spanish, or Finnish? What do you prefer? Thank you very much. Can you hear me? This is on. Thank you very much for the presentation and introduction and the invitation. My history with the Catholic Church and Catholic institutions, as Jeff said, but also Catholic institutions of higher education, as well as with Catholic theologians, is long and rich. Coming from one of the most, if not the most Lutheran countries of the world, this may be surprising. But in fact, the forms of theology which have interested me most as a scholar have been embedded in and born within the Catholic tradition. Especially Latin American liberation theologians have been my great theological teachers. This is my second time at the Dominican University. The first time I was invited a few years ago to Colombia at the Dominican University of Universidad Santo Tomás, the University of St. Thomas, on a conference on Mary, the Virgin Mary. So it was a pleasure. It turned out to be a really wonderful conference. I got many good Dominican friends, so I'm pleased to be in a Dominican setting again. Thank you again. I start from the assumption that most of you have some kind of an idea about liberation theology. So most of you are too young to have lived those times. But you know, since this is a Catholic university, Jeff told me that you all take classes in Catholic social thought, am I right? So I'm not going to give a kind of basic lesson on what liberation theology is and was about, but rather about its current situation. I would like to take a critical look at how and why liberation theology and its great innovation, the option for the poor, has been distanced from social movements in Latin America after the democratization of the region. This distance, I think, is a major reason for liberation theology having unfortunately lost pretty much its cutting-edge influence, which it had in the 1970s and in the 1980s. I also argue that this distance from the contemporary civil society of Latin America is a truer, more concrete, and a more local explanation to what has come out of liberation theology than the often heard explanation that since the historic socialism died, Soviet Union collapsed, this had an influence also on Latin American liberation theology. I think that explanation is is very inadequate, and I will turn to that later. Liberation theology is without doubt one of the most significant currents in modern theology because of its multidisciplinarity and its emphasis on social, political, and ecclesial praxis. It has come to have an importance far beyond academic theology or institutional churches. Liberation theology can be defined either narrowly or broadly. In the former sense, it is limited to the Latin American liberation theology, Teología de la Liberación, or Teología da Libertação in Portuguese, born out of a specifically Latin American context in the late 1960s. In the broader sense, liberation theology also includes other theological currents, most importantly black theologies in the USA and Southern African countries, feminist theologies from all over the world, and variations of Asian and African liberation theologies. This broad definition of liberation theology stresses the interrelatedness of different structures of oppression and domination. Liberation from these structures necessarily involves political, economic, social, racial, ethnic, sexual, and cultural aspects. Liberation theology today has an explicit emphasis on seeing these different forms of human oppression and suffering and liberation from them as layers in one complicated process. During centuries, the Catholic Church in Latin America was one of the pillars of Spanish colonial power, which Latin America having been Christianized already over 500 years ago. For centuries, the Catholic Church enjoyed a near monopoly on religious belief and practice, even when there were also religious minorities already in the colonial times. Half of the world's Catholics live still today in Latin America. However, the religious map of the region has changed quite dramatically during the last decades. There is intensifying religious competition, pluralism, as well as secularization. This is not the focus of my talk today, but any assessment of religion in Latin America must take this changed landscape into account. I just say shortly some figures. Self-identified Protestants, mostly Pentecostals, comprise roughly 1/5 of the population in the region today. About 1 in 10 identify with no religion at all. And only about 70% of the population is nominally Catholic. I say only, even though 70 may sound a lot. It has been coming down dramatically during the last 40 years. There is also growing pluralism within the Catholic Church itself. Liberation theology itself is an expression and example of this internal pluralism. The general very conflictive atmosphere and the rise of authoritarian military dictatorships all over Latin America in the 1960s and the 1970s created the conditions in which the Catholic Church had to take a political stance regarding growing violations of human rights, deepening poverty, as well as the organized armed struggle, which culminated in some cases in a successful popular revolution, such as Cuba and Nicaragua. The Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church meant a global opening of the Church to the society, as all of you know, and had an extremely important influence on especially the North and Latin American churches, Catholic churches. The Latin American Catholic Bishops' Conference, Consejo Episcopal Latinoamericano, often said as CELAM, held its meeting, as was said, in Medellin, Colombia, in 1968. This conference is often interpreted as a culmination point in the departure of the Catholic Church as an institution from its 500 years old close relationship to the state. The Conference of Medellin was not the moment of birth of liberation theology, as is sometimes said, but it was rather a moment when the Church formally, as an institution, made a preferential option for the poor and aspired to become a church of the poor. Some of the early liberation theologians had a lot of influence actually on the Medellin Conference proceedings and statements. The major accomplishments of liberation theology until today, which are lasting, I think, are first, the creation of a Christian alternative from the global South after centuries of colonialism and mission by the global North. Second, the critique from the impoverished South presented a prophetic voice within global Christianity with the tools of the tradition itself, understanding poverty and injustice as structural sin, which we have, I think we have good reasons to say that this is present already in the scriptures. And third, a new methodology for contemporary theology, which takes issues of human suffering, injustice, and bodily realities as its starting point. And last but not least, liberation theology formed an important part of the growing civil society and struggle for democracy during the military dictatorships. Actually, one of the well-known first-generation liberation theologians, Pablo Richard from Chile, I once discussed with him this claim, especially in countries of the North, that say that, oh, liberation theology died. It doesn't exist anymore. So he once said, well, if it died for a good reason. You know, it's liberation theology was an important part of the democratization processes of Latin America. So if that was the goal on a political level, and in the process liberation theology died, well, it died for a good reason. That was Pablo Richards' viewpoint. Classical liberation theology claimed the poor to be its starting point in its critical reflection of theology and the role of the churches vis-à-vis massive poverty in areas colonized by Christian Europe. Since the classical period of liberation theology, roughly 1970s and 80s, this starting point has been further developed. The poor and the option for the poor as central categories have been expanded and specified, especially due to the critique that poverty and the poor cannot be conceived merely in economic or material terms. Groups such as women, indigenous people, and Afro-Latin Americans have criticized liberation theology for having a too narrow view on poverty, the poor, and democracy. Issues of racism, sexism have not been central in classical liberation theology, nor have they been elaborated into a deeper understanding of how poverty affects different people differently. Liberation theology has formed since its beginning an important and in some cases central space in Latin America's public space. In the 1970s, liberation theology and the Iglesia Popular, the popular church part of the Catholic Church, and some Protestant churches were at the forefront of a new type of emerging civil society in the region. In many countries, liberation theology offered the language, the rationale, and even the legitimization for people in Christian churches to question economic policies that left large parts of society under the poverty line, as well as for outright opposition to military regimes and their human rights violations. If early liberation theology and the church groups close to it are analyzed as democracy movements, as I think it is correct to do, it could be said that they have succeeded in their goals. Democracy, even if fragile in many countries, has been attained. Latin America is no longer a continent of military dictatorships. Liberation theology was de facto, in fact, a public theology during the military regimes. And my argument in this paper is, however, that liberation theology has by and large lost this role. It does not mean that liberation theology is dead, as I just said. Well, is it? It is clear that Latin American liberation theology is not the same as it was decades ago. It would be more than odd if it would be, taken the vast political and religious changes in the continent and in the world. And I think liberation theologians themselves would be the first to admit this. One very common line of reasoning in the case of Latin American liberation theology, even among those basically sympathetic to it, is that the crisis and disappearance of historical socialism and the Soviet Union is the main reason for the weakening and crisis of liberation theology. I think if you look at any kind of basic book on or article on liberation theology that is written during the last 10 years, you very often see this explanation there. The proponents of this thesis see a strong causal connection between liberation theology in Latin America and historical socialism in Eastern and Central Europe. Further, they see that link primarily in ideological or theoretical terms. Marxism died, so liberation theology died. What exactly is the relationship between the collapse of socialism in European countries and the contemporary forms of Latin American liberation theology? I'm not going to answer this question since it's not my point in this talk, but I just ask if there is a causal relationship. One would presume it could be shown, And I haven't yet seen a study that has done so. Maybe there is, but I haven't seen. Most liberation theologians of the first and second generation had a reserved or openly negative relationship towards existing socialism, probably with the exception of their own Cuba. This does not exclude the fact that many, but not all, liberation theologians and intellectuals close to liberation theology have had a serious dialogue with Marx as a philosopher, and in some cases, an affinity to leftist parties and groups in different countries. However, I think this kind of an ideological explanation is weak. The causality is very difficult to show. But I would say that the link between socialism, theology, and the churches could be highlighted from the perspective of democratization, which actually happened to some extent at the same time in Latin America and Eastern Europe. There are similarities, and I'm not a political scientist, but there are some similarities between the regions, Latin America and socialist Eastern Europe, when it comes to the process of awakening of the civil society from the 1980s onwards. Ordinary people rose to resist authoritarian regimes. And Christian churches offered a space, often limited, for this resistance and reorganizing of the civil society. The role of the church, and churches, I should say, changed from that of a power holder to a representative of the civil society. And in both socialist, anti-capitalist Europe and right-wing, anti-communist Latin America of the 1970s and 80s, this role of the church was a contested one, mostly marginal, and by no means did it indicate a total conversion of the church from its previous role, but the similarities are there nevertheless. Of course, there are also vast differences between the roles of the churches, but I merely highlight some of these similarities in order to make the point that a claim of causality between the fall of socialism in Europe and phenomena such as liberation theology in Latin America should not be made too easily. It is also important in this respect to take into account the changes in the foreign policy of the United States towards Latin America after the late 1980s. The United States, as you probably know, financed and supported right-wing military coups and regimes for years in Latin America, as well as counterinsurgent groups such as the Contras in Central America. But it also had the unilateral power to seize those conflicts by withdrawing its military and financial support from those regimes. Thus, there is again a link and causality between what happened with historical socialism in Europe and what happened in Latin America. But this link, I would claim, existed most importantly in the thoughts of US foreign policy leaders. Central American peace processes and democratic changes elsewhere in Latin America were possible only after an ideological change in the United States, when the perceived threat of communism and the Cold War setting disappeared. And finally, closest to my heart, the importance of different social movements in Latin America cannot be downplayed. Human rights movements, labor unions, land reform movements, women's movements, and the popular church had an important role in the democratization process. Again, similarly to at least some former socialist countries. Thus, both external and internal reasons for the democratization of Latin American countries are true and should not too easily be separated. It is important, in spite of what I just said, to notice that there are internal problems and inadequacies in liberation theology, even when outside changes and pressures have affected the movement as well. And according to my judgment, that we can discuss after my talk, some of the greatest challenges are related to the issues, to the evasion of issues such as sexism, sexuality, and sexual ethics from a specifically Latin American perspective. All these have direct links to poverty, public health, and women's and children's well-being. Another evasion, I think, is the concentration on issues of power only on the kind of macro level of the society, and lack of dialogue and interaction with new social movements, which are all important and flourishing in the contemporary democratic space of Latin America today. How does the Latin American Catholic Church today organize itself as a modern public religion, to paraphrase Jose Casanova, a well-known sociologist of religion, in a democratic liberal society with a vibrant civil society? According to the Peruvian sociologist of religion, Catalina Romero, such transformation is possible only when a public space is developed within the ecclesial organization itself. And this is another thing that we might want to discuss afterwards. Classical liberation theology offered critical reflection both on the roles of society and politics in maintaining poverty and violence, but also on the ways theology and the churches participated in these oppressive structures. Women, indigenous people, and descendants of African slaves on the continent have all criticized liberation theology for having a too narrow view of poverty and the poor, as I stated earlier. The poorest in Latin America are to be found in racially and ethnically disadvantaged groups, as well as among women. In other words, the poverty of indigenous people, Afro-Latin Americans, and women, especially women among all these groups, is aggravated because of their ethnic, racial, and gender status. Because of this critique, many, if not all, first-generation liberation theologians have modified their thinking concerning the poor. For example, in later editions of his classic Teología de la Liberación, Theology of Liberation, or Gustavo Gutierrez, who is often considered as the father of liberation theology, I don't know. He was careful to mention that this inclusion of, in the later editions of his work, he was careful to mention that the poorest of the poor are women, indigenous people, and children. Nevertheless, this inclusion of other forms of oppression has been minor and to some extent superficial. No substantial change has occurred in liberation theology, theoretically or practically, because of this critique. The list of the oppressed is expanded, and new forms of oppression are mentioned, but these critiques are not included in the core of theorizing about poverty and theology. My point is not at all to trivialize this sensitivity to new issues that need to be included and taken seriously also by liberation theologians. My somewhat critical point is that in today's liberation theology, these social and political concerns do not have the status, either theoretically or practically, that social movements used to have in early liberation theology. The inclusion of different forms of oppression is not stemming from a concrete dialogue with the corresponding social movements, or from an in-depth knowledge of the continent's non-Christian or indigenous spiritual traditions. So in some ways, we see a liberation theology and the relationship between civil society at large and the Catholic Church going back to times before Medellin. In the early days of liberation theology, theological concerns were tied to, or they even grew out of, concrete political struggles, such as the defense of human rights during the military dictatorships, land issues, labor unions, and early women's movements. Liberation theology was born out of the political and spiritual struggle of these groups. There were believing Catholics within those movements. And no such living neutral relationship, unfortunately, exists between today's liberation theology and new social movements. The democratization of Latin American countries has given birth to new social and political movements which were not there in the early days of liberation theology. They are both the reason for and a product of democratization. In many countries, liberation theology is rightly counted among the theoretical and practical base of these movements. For example, in Brazil, both the early women's movement, which is a very interesting history to read, both the early women's history as well as the landless people's movement, MST, were born, practically born, under the auspices of the Catholic Church, which used liberation theological language and analysis for the defense of the weak and marginalized. And these new social movements, such as women's movements, environmental, ecological movements, anti-racist and indigenous rights movements, raise questions and demands that were impossible or very difficult to voice during the military dictatorships. In formally democratic countries, they also ask critical questions of the real depth and true content of democracy. How much time do I have?
3 minutes before your 30 minutes.
Okay. Lack of dialogue and cooperation between liberation theology and new social movements may thus result in liberation theologians' lack of credibility in major contemporary social issues, such as infant and maternal mortality, racism, religious pluralism, environmental issues, and popular religion, which are all relevant for women, indigenous, and African American people. The overall result is that liberation theology is seen by many, even in Latin America, as white, Western, patriarchal, and anti-sexual, or in other words, that not even liberation theology can break away from the long legacy of Christian theology in legitimizing sexism and racism. I believe that what is easily seen as mere adding of new concerns and new oppressive structures to liberation theology reflects and is possibly a result of the lack of political engagement with contemporary social movements, as I have already said. And I mean both the practical and theoretical aspects of these movements. In the case of the feminist movement, we are talking about sexism. In anti-racist Afro-Latin American movements, we are talking about racism and so on. There is plenty of research on gender, women's poverty, also in Latin American countries. There is plenty of research, primarily by anthropologists, on indigenous peoples' spiritualities in Latin America, for example. The lack of dialogue and engagement, liberation theologians have not been willing or able to create alliances with these social movements. Let me say a few words about gender and then a few words about indigenous peoples and ecology, and then I will wrap it up. The Latin American Catholic Church is, even formally as an institution, a critic of the effects of neoliberal economic policies on the poor, and thus sides with liberation theology. But it is also one of the powerful institutions which stubbornly refuses to look at the statistics on maternal and infant mortality, or to revise its teaching on sexuality, gender roles, and reproduction. It would give the option for the poor new depth and meaning if Catholic theologians, including liberation theologians, would take seriously the fact that it is not women per se, but poor women, and often very young women, who die of reasons directly related to sexuality, reproduction, and maternity, and women's lack of power to decide over them. If liberation theology takes this challenge, it is not only being faithful to and deepening its epistemological and practical meaning of the option for the poor, but it will possibly also offer an interesting example of positive synergy between liberation theology or theology and feminism from the global south. It may be unnecessary to repeat some of the statistical facts about the relationship between gender and poverty, but let me just say shortly that the United Nations General Assembly held a special session in June 2000 on gender equality, development, and peace for the 21st century. So it's a few years past already. And according to this conference, the majority of the 1.5 billion people living on $1 a day or less are women. And the gap between women and men caught in the cycle of poverty continues to widen. Women earn on average slightly more than 50% of what men earn. Women living in poverty are often denied access to credit, land, and inheritance, and their labor goes unrewarded and unrecognized. Women living in poverty lack adequate access to health care, nutrition, education, and support services, and so on. Any statistics on development and health also shows the direct link between women's well-being or lack of it and infants and children's well-being or lack of it. So female and feminist liberation theologians, it's not the same thing, but female liberation theologians, some of them call themselves also feminist liberation theologians, such as Elsa Tames, Ivone Revara, and Pilar Aquino, among others, have already for a long time expressed a critique of liberation theology from within liberation theology, from a feminist perspective. And very little has happened according to them and myself. For example, in the words of Pilar Aquino, I quote, "Very few Latin American male liberation theologians have taken the time to enter into a serious dialogue with feminist theological discourses," end of quote. According to Elsa Tames, quote, "Although the majority of liberation theologians insist that other discriminations enter the category poor, in practice it is not like that. Those of us who suffer other marginalizations feel only partly included. The terminology of the principle, the option for the poor, is challenged today by other discriminations and humiliations that go beyond the economic. The expression option for the excluded or option for the poor and excluded would explicitly give room for other oppressions, discriminations, and humiliations," end of quote. Then I will say a few words about indigenous people. As you probably know, there are several native peoples in the Americas, not just in South America. And again, according to statistics, these are from the World Bank from 2016, 14% of Latin Americans poor and 17% of the extremely poor in Latin America are from the indigenous groups. They only form less than 8% of the population, meaning that their poverty is disproportionate compared to their size. Indigenous people face poverty rates that are on average twice as high as for the rest of Latin Americans. And gender makes, again, this deepens these gaps. Indigenous women face a higher risk of poverty and exclusion than indigenous men. So the kind of layers of poverty and discrimination we have to take into account, not just one factor such as gender or race or ethnicity. They are affecting each other. From a religious point of view, or from the point of view of liberation theology, it's obvious why any talk about the option for the poor should talk not only about poor women, but also about the very specific kind of poverty that indigenous people suffer. But in addition to that, the issues of cultural and religious pluralism in Latin America are important. There is a long history of oppression of the indigenous peoples in Latin America. Ecological issues are tied into the issues of rights of the indigenous people. If you look at the political struggles of native peoples, including in the United States, in my own home country, Finland, where we have the Sami people, the only indigenous group of Europe, it's mostly that their political struggles are tied to environmental issues, to the protection of their right to land, to clean water, and a different type of ownership of land than in our nation states. So we cannot talk about ecological issues without taking this into account. From a church point of view, the tension between evangelization and whatever is meant by it, and respect, true respect for indigenous cultures, is long-rooted and more pressing than ever. Based on a theological anthropology, which has explicitly seen native peoples and their cultures as deficient. Maybe you know that when we are now in a Dominican setting, that in the specific context of Latin America, it was the Dominican friars, priests who were the early defenders of indigenous people's rights in Latin America. I don't know if you are familiar with that, with people like Bartolomé de las Casas and others. They did not question the conquest. They did not question the evangelization of the natives, but yes, they did question the slavery and the treatment and the violence. So that is an important thing to remind when we are at the Dominican College. And then finally, a few issues about ecology. Like I just said, poverty and ecological issues cannot be separated. How many of you have read the Laudato Si of Pope Francis? Oh, we are at a Catholic college. Okay, so our current Pope, I'm not Lutheran, but the current Pope has written a beautiful encyclica exactly on these issues, Laudato Si. And he, like anybody who knows something, makes the concrete link between poverty and ecology. So again, any talk about option for the poor or poverty should take into account not only issues of gender, racism, indigenous people's rights, but also ecological issues. And there is a phenomenon called Latin American eco-theology, which some actually earlier liberation theologians, such as Leonardo Boff from Brazil, have been developing. And so it could be said that even nature or natural surroundings or environment has been added to the long list of the oppressed, not just women and children and Afro-Americans, but also nature. And again, I'm not trivializing that. But again, there is the same problem than with all the other earlier mentioned groups, that there is, as far as I know, there is not a direct and deep relationship between liberation theologians or liberation theology type of sectors of the Catholic Church and environmental movements of Latin America. What we see instead is that the new social movements are becoming more secular, some of them anti-Catholic, especially the feminist movements of Latin America. And it's not only for them to blame, I would say, because there is no, the situation, I think the Catholic Church gained much of its respect as the defender of human rights and democracy in Latin America because of its concrete siding with people's struggles, whatever these were, in the 1970s and 80s. The distance between Christian liberation eco-theologians, and not just in Latin America, and the practices of the indigenous cultures may reflect a fear of what for centuries has been perceived as syncretism and non-Christian or pagan beliefs. The rich diversity of Latin America's religious landscape can be seen, for example, in the African-based religions, most notably Candomblé and Santeria, in the wide variety of indigenous religious traditions and spiritualities, and in many forms of popular Catholicism. The thinness of liberation theologians' relationship to the indigenous cultures of their continent becomes clear when these are referred to so generally and homogeneously without paying attention to the differences between them or differences inside them. And I think that liberation theology, including its feminist, eco, and indigenous versions, has been bridging the legacy of Christianity in Latin America with the region's traumatic contemporary history, speaking in a truly Latin American voice on global issues. To some extent, as I already said, liberation theology has, however, remained European, white, and male because of its lack of solidarity with post-dictatorship social movements and its unwillingness or inability to rethink and rephrase its original innovations, such as the option for the poor from new perspectives, new and necessary perspectives. Understanding well-being, liberation, and human development from the perspective of the poorest of Latin Americans would entail a more substantial critique of racism, sexism, and colonialism and their relationship to religion. This sounds as very critical of liberation theology, but as I also said, I'm a living example of a student of liberation theology. I studied and studied with some of the very well-known liberation theologians. I lived several years in Latin America. They were my teachers, and I think being at a college, having your teachers present, I think one of the great ways of showing respect to your teacher is to be able to also offer a critical perspective on them. So my critique of liberation theology stems out of deep respect for them. So thank you. Gracias. Kiitos in Finnish. And please ask. I know that my accent may be weird to some of you. So if there is something you didn't understand, please ask.
So it's our tradition to let students ask the first question.
Great. Okay, great.
So I just actually read a lot of stuff about liberation theology for my political science class yesterday, and we read an interview with James Nikoloff, and he was talking about the marginalized people in society, but he was referring to them as just poor. Like that was just the word that he was using was poor. So for people that are living in poverty as well as people that are marginalized in society. And we were kind of talking about in the class how that doesn't really work. So I was wondering, in your opinion, if in liberation theology there was a way to kind of start to gather up all of the groups that you were speaking about and kind of everyone who's marginalized in society as well as the poor, what term do you think that they should use and kind of how should they tackle that issue?
Thank you. I think it's a very good question. And I don't think it's so much about what word or concept to use, but to understand what all these groups that I mentioned also say from their part, that yes, they might, if they are poor in any possible meaning of the word, but also that poverty affects different groups differently. It makes poverty, let's say if we talk about the indigenous people, there are statistics that show that it's in every aspect of poverty, it's worse in the case if you are indigenous or Afro-Latin American or if you are a woman. So somehow it's important to use the word the poor, why not? But like Elsa Tames said, whom I quoted, the option for the poor and the excluded. That's what she said, and I think it's important to, like, let's say the feminist critique from within Latin America and from outside of not only liberation theology, but let's say the talk on poverty in general is very abstract if you don't take into account that poverty affects women very differently than men. It's not about competition, who is poorer, you know, but it's different. So it's not, and if we are talking about maternal mortality, the statistics are certain kinds of, but if you look them per country, it's poor women, it's indigenous women, it's very young women, girls, in fact, who die because of pregnancy or childbirth, not women in general, not women of middle class or better off. So it's really, in that sense, we can say that poverty affects women differently from men, but also from other women. Thank you.
Great question from a philosophy major, by the way. So I'd like to see that.
Hello. So I just had a quick question. After you talked about the accomplishments of liberation theology, you said that that it's highly criticized for its narrow view of poverty. Specifically, that just got me thinking, like, what specifically do you mean by, or what specifically is that view of poverty, like the way that it's kind of defined by liberation theology, and why is that narrow?
Well, actually, this is, thank you. It's related to your question, because a narrow view on poverty would be looking only at the kind of material, or looking at poverty only in material or economic terms, which is of course important. It is basic in a way. But I think the narrow view is exactly what I just said as a response to her, that, you know, it doesn't take into account other factors that also affect what it means to be poor. So that is basically what is meant by that.
Thank you.
The narrow characteristic we talked about, isn't that counterproductive to the whole concept of liberation theology? Shouldn't it? Does that express like the rigidity of the tradition of maybe the Catholic Church or something? So if it's not taking into consideration all the intersectionality of issues, then how is it helping further the people if it's just only on one population? You know what I mean? It's not taking its credit. Well, we said how women are affected more drastically, indigenous peoples and everything, but isn't that counterproductive to not take into consideration all those populations and what they go through?
Yes.
Yeah, I know. So what do we do?
Well, I think, you know, if you think of liberation theology, as I think it's a great Christian innovation. It's absolutely great Christian innovation. And of course we cannot expect that it would be perfect, you know, in many ways. I think its critique and the kind of thinking it represented in its early days were and are still very important. But I think the understanding in how they talked about the poor and poverty, it was considered by so many as something rather abstract. And I mean, in a kind of global discourse, they did present the voice of the poor in many ways. I think they really produced a theology of the poor or theology of poverty that is also in line with very much with the scriptures, and that is, you know, the same for the Catholic or the Protestant. So in that sense, I think they really represent a theology of poverty. But you know, at some point, you just cannot speak about poverty or the poor in such vague terms. And also, Latin American liberation theologians have been explicitly criticized by black theologians, for example, not taking into account the history of slavery in Latin America. It's not just a problem in North America or in the United States. It's a huge problem especially in some Latin American countries. Or women expressed a very critique very similar to their fellow Latin American liberation theologians than women anywhere in a way. And I think it's my answer to you is really that yes, it is counterproductive, and a kind of intersectional analysis is necessary, not only when we speak of poverty, but also when we speak of gender or we speak of racism, let's say. Yeah.
Do you think it will end up reaching that point where it will?
It has, yes. But you know, my point is my point in my paper was rather that it is theoretically there, but you know, today's liberation theology does not side with social movements in the same way as it did before. Yeah. Where it also gets the concrete kind of meat of its theology.
So earlier when you were talking about the indigenous peoples of South America, you mentioned that there were layers to discrimination. I was wondering if you could elaborate on these layers and if you believe they're interconnected. So meaning, like, let's say you fix education, you can fix housing or healthcare or something like that.
Like, do you mean like the specific difficulties that indigenous people face?
No, I mean you said layers of discrimination. So what do you?
Well, where could I start? You know, like it's education is very central. You cannot you know, lack of education in general. But second, how do you learn if you can't learn in your own language? So that is one thing that there, you know, and this is, you know, schooling, even basic schooling for indigenous children in their mother tongue is very difficult, practically non-existent in many countries, in most countries. So that is one thing, that you have to learn another, you know, colonial language, and I'm very sensitive to this because you know, my mother tongue is spoken by 5 million. So I step out of my country, and I cannot speak my mother tongue. So it's, so I know what it means also, even though I get school, I have gotten schooling in my language. That's one thing. Then the whole cultural oppression, meaning that indigenous cultures have been interpreted and are still interpreted as somehow less or worse than, let's say, European-based cultures. So whatever, you know, and that is, if you look at any indigenous group, even in a rich country like Finland, what it causes is a cultural shame. You know, a cultural kind of internalized shame, internalized view on oneself as somehow less or worse than the other. And I think that comes very close to kind of spiritual or cultural poverty. That is one important layer, even if it's not always materialized. That happened also with the Sami people in the Northern European countries. Lack of access to healthcare. You know, indigenous peoples, even though most of them nowadays actually live in cities, also in Latin America, if you live in the countryside, so if you have the traditional lifestyle of your culture, you don't live in the city. And you know, in any Latin American country, you have to look at the differences between the urban and the rural setting, because the further of the cities you are, the less you have services or access to health or educational services. So the list is really long, I think, and it also differs from country to country.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for your talk, first of all. So I guess my question for you would be, so you know, there is, I mean, I can see that there's definitely a narrow approach to this preferential option for the poor. I guess, so my question is, how can, you know, we as the, you know, the Catholic faithful, how can we encourage the church to be more inclusive of some of these other oppressive groups, some of these other oppressed groups, if that makes sense?
How? I think there are many ways, probably. I mean, use your education, and I don't mean that everybody has to speak on everything and for everybody's case. You know, it's a kind of, it becomes very easily also empty. So I would also say, as any activist actually would say, choose your fight, choose your struggle, because then you also become more specialist in it. And I think for yourself what it means to be Catholic today. Think for yourself what it means to be Christian today, and work for that direction in your profession, in your church. And of course, that's not only an issue for Catholics. I think it's for any person who considers him or herself a religious person. That, you know, not to expect that our churches and our religious communities are perfect. They are not. But then also to be bold in changing them to a direction that is more humane. And I think that's what actually liberation theology has very much been about. Thank you. Any other questions from other people than students, maybe?
Hi, Dr. Vuola. Thank you very much for your talk. You know, I was very surprised when I went to Bolivia to research the church there, and I met with missionaries who had been there for many years. Catholic missionaries, yes, in Cochabamba. And what surprised me is that they told me stories of social organizing, co-ops, etc., before Vatican II that they were occupied with. They and other foreign missionaries who came and saw the poverty and began to organize the people. And this is before Gaudium et Spes and before Medellin. So my question is, you know, sometimes I think liberation theology is attributed maybe as a cause of things, that maybe it's more an effect than the cause of a movement of the Spirit.
Well, great question. I totally agree that, of course, liberation theologians were not the first to help the poor, you know. So Christian churches have a long history, including the Catholic Church in Latin America, of working with the poor, siding with the poor, organizing the poor. And we could take several examples even from previous centuries. But I wouldn't put it in so maybe binary terms that it's either cause or effect. You know, very few things are like that. So I think what liberation theology gave maybe a blessing, so to say, to Christians, both priests and monks and nuns and lay people working with the poor. There was a theological rational and theological language to the work they were already doing, and at the same time, a theological language that was maybe more directed to the rich countries, to the global Christian community. That look what we are doing, and our Christianity looks very different from yours, and I think that is maybe yes an outcome of the work that they were doing in practice, but it also, well, it's a snowball effect in many ways, I think. But I totally agree with you. Then, how much do we have time? Other questions? There is a good.
Hi. You had begun by mentioning the Soviet Union and the impact that the decline of the Soviet Union may have had on the of liberation theology. The more recent example that I hear is the economic and social collapse of Venezuela, and whether you want to opine on that specifically or more generally. What I hear recently in regards to the Venezuelan experience is that, and this is a devil's advocate comment, that perhaps there are incompatibilities between liberation theology and the principles of democracy and perhaps of the principles of capitalism. So whether you want to get specific in terms of Venezuela or speak more generally about those compatibilities or incompatibilities that may exist, I was curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to speak in very general terms. My critique, what I said about the disappearance of Soviet Union and socialism, was mainly directed to a kind of very easy explanation about what happened with liberation theology after 1990s or something. So I just say that it's a too abstract explanation. Another reason, it's clear that the kind of pre-collapse Soviet Union kind of historical socialism in Europe is very different from the socialist experiments of today's Latin America, such as Venezuela of Chavez or Nicaragua of Daniel Ortega. And I think we can all agree that, those experiments are not real, going to a nice direction, So, but what is their link to liberation theology is actually a very good question and should be studied, I would say. But I would, at least in the case of Hugo Chavez and Daniel Ortega, there is, as far as I know, there is no link really between liberation theology or even the Catholic churches of their countries and what they have been doing as socialist presidents. So I would think a liberation theological response, if there were such a response to, let's say, what is going in Venezuela, would be an outright condemnation of what the country is doing today. Power-thirsty government, corrupt government, not exactly like the military dictatorships of earlier decades, but working against the interest of its own people. So I would think that the liberation theological response would be that, irrelevant, irrespective, even if Nicolas Maduro calls his government socialist.
I know that Chavez in particular at certain points adopted some of the language of liberation theology.
Yeah.
I agree with you that what he did and what the Soviet Union became was inconsistent with what we would consider the philosophy of liberation theology. I'm curious, though, whether or not you believe at the national level, any nation, either in Latin America or elsewhere, has attempted to adopt the principles of liberation theology. Because for me, it's difficult to find or to identify at the national level a nation, a government that has truly attempted it.
No, and I think that is too much to expect from a theological movement. But you know, it had a strong influence. It really had a strong influence, especially in Central America, especially in Brazil, to some extent in Chile. So it had a real, concrete, true influence on national politics, both before democratization and after that. But you know, whether any nation has implied liberation theology, well, I don't know of such a country in, and my question would also be, should it happen so or not?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I know this is a little dangerous for a Roman Catholic to ask a Lutheran, but you spoke so much about democratization, and I was expecting you at some times to say that what liberation theology needs to call for is democracy in the Catholic Church. So could you say a little bit about that, or maybe why you hesitated, if that came across your mind?
No, I don't think I hesitated. Well, that has been a theme for many liberation theologians. You know, they have been very critical, with some variation between them, very critical of the kind of hierarchical model of the church. You know, the power of the clergy versus the laity, if that's what you mean. Role of women, yes, even some otherwise not so, you know, liberation theologians who didn't take so much women's issues into account, yes, have criticized of you know, women's situation in the Catholic Church. So I just didn't mention it because I was focusing maybe more on the social or political level. But you know, it's interesting that Leonardo Boff, who was silenced by the Vatican during John Paul II, one of the very well-known liberation theologians from Brazil, it's often assumed that he was silenced because of his supposedly socialist or liberationist kind of political views. But in fact, he was silenced after his book, Igreja, Carisma y Poder, which is in English, Church, Charism and Power. And it's maybe one of the most critical books written by liberation theology about the Catholic Church and the lack of democracy within the Catholic Church. And he was actually silenced because of his views of the church and not so much of his political views.
Thank you. Can we take a moment and thank our speaker, please?
By the way, I didn't bring the gold from Finland as he assumed. It was warmer in Helsinki yesterday when I left.
So please join us for the reception in the great room.